It was still dark when the snow stopped falling, and the silence that followed felt unnatural, like the battlefield itself was holding its breath. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, just before dawn, a single Soviet soldier lay pressed into the frozen ground, listening to the low rumble of engines he was never meant to hear so close. The sound was heavy, metallic, confident. German armour. Panzers moving forward, certain that nothing alive stood in their way. In the next few hours, one of those tanks would vanish from German control and reappear where it had no right to be. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. And the man who took it was not an officer, not a famous ace, not a legend yet. He was a Red Army soldier who simply refused to die quietly. By the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front had become a machine that crushed men without mercy. Entire divisions disappeared in weeks. Towns changed hands so often that road signs became useless. On maps, commanders drew arrows and boxes, but on the ground, it was chaos, mud, fire, and cold. This story begins in late November, near the outskirts of a battered village west of Kalach-on-Don, not far from the larger storm gathering around Stalingrad. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the ground was hard as iron. Frost clung to rifles, uniforms, and skin alike. Survival depended as much on luck as skill. The soldier's name was Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrinenko. He was a tank man by training, but on that morning he was not inside a tank. His unit had been hit hard the day before. German artillery had smashed their position, scattering survivors and leaving burning wrecks frozen into the landscape. By nightfall, command structure barely existed. Small groups huddled wherever they could find cover, waiting for orders that never came. Lavrinenko found himself separated from his crew, armed with only a submachine gun, a few grenades, and whatever resolve he had left. As dawn crept in, thin and grey, the sound of engines returned. German Panzer III. Tanks rolled forward cautiously, their commanders convinced that Soviet resistance in this sector had collapsed. Infantry followed behind, using the tanks as moving shields. The Germans were experienced, disciplined, and confident. They had done this many times before. What they did not expect was resistance from a man who should not have been there at all. Lavrinenko crawled to the edge of a shallow ditch and watched through the drifting steam of his own breath. One tank stood out. It had stopped slightly ahead of the others, its engine idling as the crew scanned the terrain. The hatch on top was open for better visibility. That small detail changed everything. Lavrinenko understood tanks. He knew their weaknesses. He knew that a machine this powerful still depended on human moments of carelessness. Time slowed. The snow muffled sound. German voices carried faintly through the air. Relaxed, almost casual. Lavrinenko counted his grenades again. He knew he would get only one chance. If he failed, he would be torn apart by machine gun fire or crushed under steel tracks. There would be no heroics, no last stand, just another body buried by snow. He waited until the tank began to pivot slightly, its turret turning away from him. Then he moved. He rose from the ditch and sprinted forward, boots slipping on ice, heart pounding so loud it felt like it might give him away. The distance was short, but felt endless. A German infantryman shouted something, confused, pointing. Lavrinenko threw himself against the tank's side and pulled himself up using frozen handholds and spare track links. The world became noise and motion. He yanked a grenade free, pulled the pin with his teeth, and dropped it through the open hatch. There was no dramatic explosion, just a sharp, brutal blast and a scream cut short. Smoke poured out of the opening. Lavrinenko did not stop. He forced the hatch wider and fired his submachine gun downward, emptying the magazine into the cramped interior. The tank shuddered, engine still running, now uncontrolled. For a brief moment, he stood alone on top of a German panzer, surrounded by stunned enemy soldiers who could not quite process what they were seeing. Then instinct took over. German machine guns opened fire. Bullets sparked against armour. Lavrinenko dropped inside the turret, slamming the hatch shut behind him. Inside the tank, the air was thick with smoke and blood. Bodies were slumped against controls. Training kicked in. He shoved the dead commander aside, wiped the optics as best he could, and scanned the instrument panel. The controls were German, but a tank was still a tank. Throttle, clutch, steering levers. He adjusted his position, fighting panic, forcing his breathing to slow. Outside, German infantry scattered, some diving for cover, others backing away in disbelief. No one expected the tank to move. That hesitation saved him. Lavrinenko engaged the clutch and lurched the Panzer forward, grinding gears in a way that would have made a German mechanic cringe. The tank rolled, slow at first, then faster, crushing snow and debris beneath its tracks. Now came the most dangerous part: identification. German tanks firing on their own infantry was rare but not unheard of in confusion. Lavrinenko aimed the turret toward a cluster of German soldiers regrouping behind a low ridge. He fired the main gun. The recoil slammed through the tank. The shell exploded among the infantry, throwing bodies and equipment into the air. Shock rippled across the battlefield. German soldiers froze, then broke. Shouts of confusion turned into screams. Officers tried to restore order, but the damage was done. The tank they trusted had become something else entirely. A weapon turned inward. Lavrinenko did not stop. He fired again and again, each shot calculated, each movement faster as his confidence grew. Another German tank tried to respond, turrets swinging toward him, but hesitation cost them precious seconds. Lavrinenko drove straight at it, firing at close range. The shell struck the side armour, punching through and igniting the fuel. Flames erupted as the German tank ground to a halt. Within minutes, what had been an organised advance collapsed into chaos. German infantry pulled back, dragging wounded with them. Smoke drifted over the frozen field. Lavrinenko finally turned the tank towards Soviet lines, following landmarks he half remembered from maps and briefings. Every second inside enemy territory felt like borrowed time. When he reached Soviet positions, sentries nearly fired on him. A German panzer emerging from the fog was not a comforting sight. Only frantic signals and shouted Russian curses stopped them from opening fire. The tank rolled to a halt, engine coughing, and Lavrinenko climbed out, exhausted, blackened with soot, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. For a moment, no one spoke. Then questions poured in. Where did he get the tank? Where was his unit? How was this even possible? Lavrinenko had no dramatic answers. He simply said he saw an opportunity and took it. News of the captured panzer moved quickly up the chain of command. In a war filled with massive operations and countless deaths, small acts like this mattered more than maps could show. They boosted morale. They reminded soldiers that the enemy was not invincible, that machines, no matter how powerful, still depended on people. Lavrinenko was soon reassigned to a newly formed tank unit as the Red Army prepared for its next moves around Stalingrad. The war was far from over. In fact, its most brutal phase was just beginning. But somewhere in the frozen fields west of the Volga, German commanders now had a new fear to add to their list. Not just Soviet tanks, not just numbers, but the dangerous unpredictability of a single, determined soldier. By the afternoon of the same day, the captured panzer sat half-hidden behind a line of burned-out Soviet trucks, its grey armour now streaked with soot and hastily painted red markings. Mechanics circled it like surgeons around a wounded patient, touching the steel, checking the tracks, peering into the engine compartment with equal parts disbelief and excitement. German engineering was familiar to them, but seeing a working panzer captured intact was rare. Seeing one captured by a single soldier, under fire, without support, was almost unheard of. Lavrinenko barely noticed the attention. He sat on an ammo crate nearby, hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot tea, staring at nothing. Shock always came late. His body was still buzzing, his ears ringing, his mind replaying the moment he dropped the grenade through the hatch, again and again. In war, survival often felt unreal, like waking from a dream that could turn into a nightmare at any second. Officers arrived before nightfall. They asked for every detail, down to the smallest movement, where the tank was positioned, how many infantry were nearby, how quickly the Germans reacted. These details mattered. The Red Army was learning fast, adapting faster than the enemy expected. Every captured weapon, every mistake by the Germans became part of that learning process. The Panzer itself was examined carefully. It was a Panzer III, late model, armed with a 50mm gun and decent optics. Not the most powerful German tank, but reliable and well balanced. Soviet crews respected it. The armour was thinner than a T-34, but its internal layout was efficient and the optics were superior. Engineers marked weak points, took measurements, and made notes that would later find their way into training manuals and intelligence reports. Within days, the tank was repaired and repainted with large red stars on the turret and hull. It would not be used in frontline combat immediately. Friendly fire was a constant risk, and confusion could be deadly. Instead, it became a moving classroom. Crews climbed inside, learning how German tanks handled, how fast they could turn, how quickly they could reload. Knowledge was a weapon, and this tank had provided it at the cost of German lives and one man's nerve. Lavrinenko returned to active duty soon after. He was assigned to a T-34 unit, where his understanding of enemy armour made him valuable beyond his rank. He was calm in battle, aggressive when needed, and careful with his shots. He did not waste shells. He did not chase glory. He focused on destroying the enemy before the enemy could destroy him. The Eastern Front in early 1943 was changing. Stalingrad had become a symbol of something larger than strategy. It was proof that the German army could be surrounded, starved, and broken. Morale among Soviet troops, once battered and thin, began to harden into confidence. But confidence did not mean safety. The Germans still fought hard. Their tank crews were experienced, their commanders skilled, and their weapons deadly. Stories like Lavrinenko's spread quietly through the ranks, not as official propaganda at first, but as whispers around campfires and inside dugouts. A soldier who stole a panzer, a man who turned German steel against German flesh. These stories mattered. They gave shape to hope. They reminded exhausted men that courage could still bend the course of events, even in small ways. German reports from the sector mention confusion caused by enemy use of captured equipment. Commanders warned tank crews to be more cautious, to keep hatches closed, to watch for close-in threats even in areas believed to be secure. That alone was a victory. Fear changed behaviour. Caution slowed advances. Hesitation created openings. Lavrinenko never spoke much about that morning. When asked, he shrugged it off. He said the Germans made a mistake. He said he was lucky. In truth, it was both. War rewarded those who could recognize opportunity in chaos. Many soldiers saw the same dangers. Few saw a way through them. As spring approached and the snow melted into thick mud, fighting shifted again. Tanks bogged down. Supply lines strained. Battles became slower, grinding affairs. Lavrinenko's unit saw action near Kursk later that year, where armoured warfare reached a scale the world had never seen. Thousands of tanks clashed across fields and villages, steel against steel, engines roaring day and night. By then, Lavrinenko was no longer just a survivor. He was a veteran. He had learned when to push and when to pull back. He taught younger crewmen what to listen for, what to fear, and what not to fear. He reminded them that tanks were not monsters. They were machines. Machines could break. Machines could be taken. The captured panzer from that winter morning did not survive the war. Like most vehicles on the Eastern Front, it was eventually destroyed, stripped for parts, or abandoned as the front moved west. But its impact lasted longer than its steel frame. It represented a moment when the balance tipped, not because of massive forces, but because of human decision. Historians would later argue about numbers, about how many tanks were destroyed, how many soldiers killed. Those debates mattered for understanding the war, but they missed something important. War is not only shaped by grand plans and giant armies. It is shaped by moments when individuals refuse to accept the role assigned to them. Lavrinenko survived that winter. Many did not. He did not live to see the war's end, falling later in combat during one of the many brutal advances westward. His name would appear in records, then fade into footnotes. But the story of the captured Panzer remained, retold in fragments, in memoirs, in training anecdotes passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. It served as a reminder that courage does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a man in a frozen ditch, counting grenades, listening to engines, and deciding that fear will not decide the outcome of the next few seconds. Sometimes it looks like stolen steel, looks like rolling the wrong way across a battlefield. On the Eastern Front, where death was constant and mercy rare, moments like that mattered more than anyone could measure. They cracked the image of German invincibility. They hardened Soviet resolve. And they proved that even in a war defined by machines, the most dangerous weapon was still the human will behind them. That is the story of the Soviet soldier who captured a panzer and turned it on its own army. Not a miracle, not a legend polished by time, just a moment where training, instinct, and courage crossed paths, and history moved, if only slightly, in a different direction. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.